A regular day at the bank turns into a battle for respect. It was a typical afternoon at the bustling downtown branch of First Pacific Bank. The kind of day that seems indistinguishable from any other. A steady hum of activity, the shuffle of footsteps on cold marble floors, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards in the background. But as the minutes passed and the line of customers grew longer, a quiet unease began to settle over the crowd. Everyone could feel the pressure mounting, the impatience weaving through the air like an invisible thread. Linda Carter, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher, stood in line, her hands trembling slightly around an envelope she had brought with her. She had never been one to ask for help, never one to demand special treatment. A proud woman who had spent decades shaping young minds, she had always been self-sufficient, fiercely independent. But today something had changed. A mistake, small but significant, had appeared on her account. A series of unexplained charges that, while modest on their own, added up to more than she could afford to lose. Linda's fixed income from her years of teaching left little room for mistakes like this. Every dollar was precious. She had worked hard her whole life, making sure she didn't rely on anyone, never asking for anything she didn't earn. So walking into the bank, holding that envelope with her receipt and account details, was a small act of vulnerability that felt out of character. It wasn't easy to admit that something had gone wrong, especially when the people around her, young and old, were so eager to get in and out of the bank as quickly as possible. She approached the counter, her heart pounding lightly in her chest. The young teller, Brittany Wallace, didn't even glance up from her computer as Linda stood there, waiting for some acknowledgement. When Brittany finally did look up, it was with a cold, dismissive glance. Her fingers didn't slow their tapping on the keyboard, and the tired look in her eyes suggested that Linda was just another face in the crowd, just another customer who would be processed as quickly as possible and sent on her way. Linda cleared her throat, steadying herself before speaking. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice soft but firm. "I believe there's been a mistake with my account. I've been charged some fees that I wasn't informed about. I've had this account for over 30 years and never seen anything like this before." She placed the receipt on the counter, hoping that a simple explanation would clear up the confusion. Brittany's response was immediate, almost rehearsed. "Those are standard maintenance fees, ma'am," she said, her voice flat and uninterested. She barely looked up at Linda, her attention already drifting back to whatever task was occupying her mind. Linda felt a pang of disbelief. Standard fees? She had never seen such charges, and the confusion in her heart grew as she realized that the young teller hadn't taken a single moment to truly look at the situation. With a deep breath, Linda tried again. "I understand the fees, but they've never been this high before. I just want to understand what happened. I've always kept my account in good standing." Brittany sighed, barely concealing her frustration. "If you didn't read the fine print, that's not our problem," she said, dismissively shoving the receipt back toward Linda. There was no apology, no compassion, just a cold, hard reminder that Linda's long years of loyalty to the bank seemed to matter little now. It wasn't just the lack of empathy that cut deep. It was the way the entire atmosphere shifted. The people around them, once murmuring about their own frustrations with long wait times, now watched in silence. No one came to Linda's defense. No one looked her way to offer a kind word or an ounce of sympathy. In that moment, Linda wasn't just fighting for her money, she was fighting for her dignity. She could feel the weight of their indifference pressing on her shoulders, heavier than any fee could ever be. The more she tried to speak, the smaller she felt. The louder Brittany's voice became, the more the room seemed to shrink. No one had to say a word. The judgment was clear. She didn't matter. Linda wasn't a young, tech-savvy millennial with the energy to challenge a corporation. She wasn't the sort of customer that bank employees felt any particular need to impress. She was just an old woman, clinging to her independence and hoping for fairness in a world that often overlooked people like her. But as the humiliation began to seep into the air, Linda realized that the real battle wasn't just about the money. It was about the respect that every human being deserved, regardless of age, gender, or status. A sudden and unlikely hero, Michael Jordan, steps in. As Linda's heart sank under the weight of the humiliation, she tried desperately to hold on to some shred of dignity. Her throat was dry, the words stuck somewhere between her head and her heart, but she couldn't bring herself to speak any more. What was the point? Every attempt she made to explain herself had been met with condescension, every question dismissed as if she were a mere inconvenience. She looked around the room, but no one seemed to care. The other customers, who just moments ago had been complaining about the long wait times, were now oddly silent, averting their eyes. It was as if Linda had become invisible, an irrelevant figure in their midst, a nuisance in the flow of their busy lives. She swallowed hard, trying to suppress the sting of tears that threatened to rise. All she had wanted was a little clarity, a simple explanation for the sudden and mysterious charges on her account. But instead, she was met with cold indifference from the people she had trusted for decades. The world seemed so much colder in that moment, and Linda wondered if perhaps her years of loyalty had counted for nothing at all. And then, just when she thought she might crumble under the weight of it all, something unexpected happened. A deep, steady voice broke through the tension, as if the air itself had been shattered. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The words came out clear and calm, but there was a force behind them that stopped everyone in their tracks. The chatter in the room died instantly. Heads turned toward the entrance. And for the first time since Linda had stepped into the bank, the energy in the room shifted. A man stood there, framed by the doorway, his posture exuding a quiet strength. At first glance, he seemed like any other customer, a man in a simple black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. But there was something about him, something that made people straighten up, something that commanded respect without needing to ask for it. His presence filled the room in an almost unexplainable way, as if he carried with him the weight of authority and experience. Carl Jensen, the bank manager, turned slowly, his face darkening with annoyance as he took in the sight of the new figure standing at the entrance. His posture stiffened, as though preparing for some sort of confrontation. But what was to come was nothing like Carl had expected. The man stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Who do you think you are, treating this woman like that?" His words were slow and deliberate, each one cutting through the air like a knife. Carl, who had spent years perfecting the art of dismissing customers he deemed unworthy of his time, took a step back, clearly thrown off by the unexpected challenge. Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. Was this man really standing up for her? Did he not see how the world around her had already dismissed her? How she had been reduced to nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with quickly and efficiently? She had spent a lifetime teaching her students the importance of standing up for what's right, but never had she imagined a moment like this, where someone, a total stranger, would step into her fight when she was too exhausted to continue. The man pulled off his baseball cap, revealing his face. At that moment, a collective gasp rippled through the bank. The recognition was instant. It wasn't just any ordinary man who had spoken up. It was Michael Jordan. Yes, that Michael Jordan, the basketball legend, the man who had transcended sports and become an icon in his own right. His presence seemed to absorb the attention of everyone in the room. The energy shifted once more, and the tension began to melt away, replaced by a sense of awe, a sense of power that had entered the room with him. Carl, still trying to assert some form of control, managed a nervous chuckle. "Mr. Jordan, this really isn't your business. We're just handling some routine issues here." His words were empty, and his demeanor revealed a desperation to downplay the situation, to avoid the spotlight now shining on his poor treatment of Linda. But Michael Jordan was unyielding. He raised his hand slightly, cutting off Carl before he could finish speaking. "It doesn't matter who I am," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "What matters is how you're treating this woman. You should be ashamed." Linda stood there, frozen, staring at Michael Jordan. She had heard stories, of course, heard about his legendary career, his achievements on the basketball court, his commitment to excellence. But this was something entirely different. He wasn't here for a photo op. He wasn't here because he needed the spotlight. No, Michael Jordan was here because he recognized injustice when he saw it, and he wasn't about to let Linda be ignored. Carl's confident stance faltered, and for the first time that day he seemed unsure of himself. Michael Jordan's words carried weight, and it was clear that the crowd and the bank felt it too. The tension in the room had shifted. The bystanders who had been silent until now began to pay attention. What had started as a simple dispute over banking fees had suddenly turned into something much more significant, something far bigger than just Linda's situation. Michael Jordan turned to Linda, his voice now softer, almost gentle. "Ma'am," he said, his expression steady but compassionate, "can you show me what's going on here? Let me take a look at those charges." Linda, still in shock, hesitated for a moment before handing over the envelope she had been holding tightly in her hands. As Michael scanned the documents, his expression remained impassive, but Linda could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He wasn't just reading the papers. He was piecing together the story, understanding exactly what had happened, and he wasn't going to let it slide. And in that moment, Linda realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe before. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone had noticed her struggle. Someone had seen her as a person, not as a problem. Exposing the deeper problem, an unexpected revelation. As Michael Jordan stood there, his calm yet unwavering presence filling the room, the atmosphere shifted from one of frustration and helplessness to one of anticipation. The tension in the air was thick, as if everyone in the room could feel the weight of what was unfolding. Linda, still trying to process the surreal reality of what was happening, watched as Michael examined the documents she had handed him. His eyes scanned the receipts and account statements with the focus of someone used to assessing the most important details. But there was also a quiet understanding in his gaze. This wasn't about just one woman's bank fees. It was about something much larger. Something that affected people like Linda every day, even if they weren't brave enough to speak up. For years, Linda had been a loyal customer of the bank. She had trusted them with her savings, believing that, in return, she would receive respect and transparency. But the charges that had suddenly appeared on her account were a slap in the face to her years of loyalty. There was no explanation, no heads up about the new fees, no apology for the inconvenience. Just a cold, automated message telling her that if she didn't keep more money in her account, she would face these charges. But it wasn't just Linda who had suffered. As Michael continued to look over her account, a realization began to take shape. Not just for him, but for everyone else in the room. He wasn't just looking at one woman's struggle. He was looking at a systematic problem that affected far more people than he could have ever imagined. The longer he stared at the paperwork, the clearer it became. These charges weren't isolated to Linda. They had started appearing for other customers around the same time, and they seemed to disproportionately target the elderly, those less likely to challenge the system. Linda's voice, though soft, was clear and unwavering. "I've had this account for over 30 years, she said. "I've never seen these charges before. They just appeared 2 months ago. I never agreed to them." There was a certain finality to her words, a deep-rooted truth that had been ignored for too long. She wasn't just questioning a fee. She was questioning a system that had failed her. Michael Jordan, never one to shy away from standing up for what's right, nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but filled with determination. He turned to Carl Jensen, the bank manager, his voice steady but cutting. 2 months ago, you say? That's when these fees started appearing? So why did they suddenly triple on her account?" Carl's face flushed red and he stammered. We adjust fees according to company policy. If she doesn't meet the minimum balance requirements, the system automatically applies those charges. That's how it works." Michael's eyes narrowed. "So you're telling me that no one actually checks these fees? You're just assuming the system is always right? That's your excuse?" Carl hesitated, his confidence waning under Michael's gaze. "The system is designed to be accurate," he muttered defensively. "The charges are automated. We don't review individual accounts unless there's a formal request." Michael leaned in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "But you're not reviewing them, are you? You're not checking if they're actually correct. You're just letting the system do whatever it wants." His voice grew firmer, the underlying anger clear in his tone. "And it's not just Linda, is it? You're targeting the elderly, people who may not have the energy to question what's going on. You're taking advantage of them." Carl's face paled. He had heard enough. He knew that Michael was right. He had been getting away with it for so long that he had convinced himself that no one would ever question the system. But now, everything was falling apart. The truth was out in the open, and there was no hiding it anymore. The bank's so-called policies were nothing more than an excuse to exploit those who were least likely to fight back. The crowd in the bank, which had remained passive until now, began to murmur in agreement. Customers who had been waiting in line, impatient and frustrated with their own banking issues, now turned their eyes to the confrontation unfolding in front of them. They had seen it, they had felt it, the injustice, the lack of accountability, and they weren't going to stay silent any longer. Michael turned toward them, his voice strong and commanding. "How many of you have had unexpected fees show up on your accounts in the past few months?" he asked, holding Linda's papers up for everyone to see. At first there was only silence, but then slowly a few hesitant hands went up. A middle-aged man in a worn-out work uniform raised his hand, followed by a young woman holding a baby, and then an elderly couple at the back. One by one, more hands joined in until the entire room seemed to be agreeing. The problem was much bigger than Linda. It wasn't just her. This was affecting everyone. Michael's eyes scanned the room, his tone growing more intense. "You see, this isn't just a mistake. This is a pattern, and it's not just about fees. It's about the way you treat your customers, the way you treat the elderly, the vulnerable, the ones who have been loyal to you for years, trusting you to do right by them." Carl stood frozen, his face ashen. The walls seemed to close in around him as the truth echoed through the bank. He had built his career on dismissing people like Linda, people he thought were beneath him. But now, with everyone watching, the truth was undeniable. Michael Jordan wasn't just challenging Carl Jensen's authority. He was exposing a deeper, systemic issue. And for the first time that day, Carl realized that his actions had consequences that went far beyond the walls of the bank. The ripple effect, standing up for what's right. As Michael Jordan's words settled in the air, there was an unmistakable shift in the room. The tension, once palpable and heavy with judgment, seemed to dissolve, replaced by a collective breath, a moment of clarity and realization. Linda, who had once felt like an insignificant figure standing alone, now stood at the center of something much larger. The spotlight, once harsh and cold, now seemed to shine with a warmth that enveloped her. Michael had not only challenged the oppressive policies of the bank, but had also become the voice for those who had suffered in silence. The crowd, which had remained passive until now, began to stir. A few customers, their discomfort now giving way to a sense of solidarity, exchanged looks of quiet agreement. It wasn't just Linda who had felt the sting of unfair treatment. It was all of them. The young woman with a baby in tow, the elderly couple in the back, the hard-working man in a worn-out uniform. They all recognized the injustice. They had all been victims, in one way or another, of a system that had failed them. A system that seemed to care little about their struggles, their dignity, or their hard-earned money. And then, slowly, hands began to rise. Hesitantly at first, as if unsure whether it was safe to join the movement. A middle-aged man near the back of the room raised his hand, his eyes glancing toward the others, seeking confirmation. Then, one by one, more hands followed. Customers who had once been consumed by their own frustrations now found a shared voice. It wasn't just Linda. This was a problem that had touched everyone, whether they were willing to admit it or not. Michael Jordan, standing tall and resolute, scanned the room, his eyes sweeping over the sea of customers who now found themselves in the midst of an unexpected movement. His voice, once calm and controlled, was now filled with purpose. "You see what's happening here?" he asked, his gaze never leaving the crowd. "It's not just Linda who's been affected. It's all of you. And it's time we stand up and demand what's right." For a moment, Carl Jensen, the bank manager, looked like a man trapped in a corner. His facade of control had cracked, and he could feel the weight of everyone's gaze. The reality was that, up until this point, he had never been held accountable for his actions. His position of power had allowed him to dismiss complaints, to treat customers like nuisances, to be managed and pushed aside. But now, with the room shifting against him, he realized just how much power had slipped through his fingers. He wasn't in control anymore. Michael had taken that away, and the people in the room were not going to let Carl's dismissive attitude slide any longer. Michael's gaze softened as he turned back to Linda. "Ma'am," he said gently, "can you tell me more about these fees? Why are they suddenly showing up now?" Linda, still processing the weight of what had just happened, nodded slowly. "I've been a loyal customer of this bank for over 30 years," she began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her frustration and disappointment. "And suddenly, 2 months ago, these fees appeared. They're small amounts, but they add up, and I was never told about them. It's as if they were hidden in the fine print." Michael nodded, his eyes now focused on Carl, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority. "So these fees, which you claim are standard, have only appeared in the past 2 months, after a change in policy? And Linda isn't the only one who's been affected, is she?" Carl opened his mouth to protest, but the words failed him. He knew he couldn't deny it anymore. The truth was out. The pattern had been exposed. The new charges hadn't just impacted Linda, they had begun to affect others too. And now, with Michael Jordan standing at the center of it all, there was no way to sweep the issue under the rug any longer. As the silence stretched on, the customers in the bank began to murmur. They had seen it too. They had felt it, perhaps in smaller ways, but they had felt the sting of unfairness, of being overlooked, of being treated as if their concerns didn't matter. And now, with Michael Jordan's words ringing in their ears, they knew they weren't alone. Michael took another step forward, his voice steady and powerful as he addressed Carl. "You can't keep hiding behind policies. If those policies are hurting people, if they're unfair, then they need to change. And you need to take responsibility for the harm they've caused." Carl's face had turned pale, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the realization. For the first time in his career, he felt vulnerable. His smug confidence, built on years of dismissing customers like Linda, was unraveling. He had assumed that his position of power would protect him, that no one would challenge the system he had grown so accustomed to. But now, standing before him, was someone who had the power to expose everything. The very thing Carl had worked so hard to keep hidden. Michael turned to the crowd once more, his gaze sweeping over them as if reminding them of their collective strength. "This isn't just about one person's fees," he said. "It's about all of us, about standing up for fairness, about not letting anyone get away with treating us like we don't matter." Linda felt a surge of gratitude, a quiet sense of empowerment. For the first time in a long while, she felt like her voice had been heard, like she wasn't just another old woman who would be pushed aside. Michael had given her, and all of the others in that room, a chance to reclaim their dignity, to stand up for what was right. And the ripple effect of that moment was just beginning. The consequences unfold, a lesson in accountability. As the tension in the room shifted, Carl Jensen stood frozen, his face pale and his thoughts scattered. He had never expected this, a confrontation of this magnitude, so public and so undeniable. For years he had concealed his indifference behind the guise of corporate policy, confident that no one would ever question the system he had long accepted. But now, with Michael Jordan standing at the center of the storm and a room full of customers watching, Carl's illusion of control had evaporated. His career, once secure in the routine of dismissing complaints, was suddenly on the line. The weight of the moment settled heavily on him, a weight that seemed to press against his chest as he realized the ramifications of what was unfolding. Michael's unwavering gaze never left Carl. "You've made a mistake, Carl," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "And now it's time to fix it." Carl knew he had no choice. He had been exposed, and there was no easy escape. The room, which had once been a place where he could easily dismiss complaints and return to his daily routine, now felt like a courtroom. And Michael Jordan was the prosecutor, unflinching and resolute, with the eyes of the public and the bank's customers fixed squarely on him. It wasn't just the bank that was under scrutiny. It was Carl himself. He had made his career by ignoring the concerns of customers like Linda, treating them as insignificant obstacles in the way of his promotion and career advancement. But now, Michael Jordan had turned that hierarchy upside down, and Carl found himself at the bottom of it, forced to face the consequences of his actions. The silence in the room was deafening as Carl, unable to muster a coherent defense, turned toward the computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keys, but the confidence he once held was gone. He had underestimated the power of standing up for what was right, and now, with his job and reputation on the line, Carl could only watch as his world crumbled around him. Behind the counter, Brittany, the young teller who had once shown no empathy for Linda's situation, glanced nervously at Carl. Her fingers twitched, unsure of what to do next. But Michael Jordan wasn't about to let the situation slip away. "Fix it," he said, his voice calm yet authoritative. "Reverse the charges, every single one of them, and then apologize. To Linda, to everyone in this room." Carl's jaw clenched. He was trapped. But he knew that his refusal to comply would cost him everything. He looked at the screen and, with a heavy sigh, began to reverse the charges, one by one. As the numbers changed, the weight that had hung in the air seemed to lift, and a sense of relief began to spread through the room. Linda, her hands still trembling from the experience, watched as Carl grudgingly carried out the task. She had come to the bank that day seeking answers, but she had never imagined that a confrontation like this would be what it took to get them. She felt a sense of closure as the charges were reversed, but it was more than just a financial victory. For the first time that day, Linda felt her dignity restored. The people around her, once passive bystanders, had witnessed the truth, and she no longer felt invisible. As Carl continued to reverse the charges, Michael turned back to the room, addressing the now captivated audience. "This isn't just about fees, it's about respect. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. I want all of you to remember this moment," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. "When we stay silent in the face of injustice, we become complicit. But when we speak up, when we demand what's right, we change the world. Never forget that." The room, which had once felt heavy with tension, now felt lighter. The customers, who had once been indifferent to Linda's plight, now seemed to nod in quiet agreement. There was a palpable sense of relief, of justice being served, not just for Linda, but for all the customers who had been made to feel insignificant, ignored, and unheard. Michael Jordan had not just spoken out for Linda, he had spoken out for all of them, and in doing so he had reminded them of the power of their voices, of their right to stand up for themselves, to demand fairness, and to never let anyone treat them as less than they were. As the last of the charges were reversed, Carl turned to Linda, his face flushed with defeat. He had no choice but to offer an apology. I apologize for the misunderstanding," he muttered, his voice lacking sincerity but filled with the unmistakable weight of having been caught in a lie. Linda didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded, accepting the apology without a word. There was no need for more. She had already won, her dignity restored, the injustice righted. But as she walked away from the counter, her heart was lighter, not because of the money returned to her account, but because for the first time in a long time she felt seen, she had been heard. The moment wasn't over, though. As Michael turned to leave, he could hear the sound of a phone's notification pinging in the background. One by one, customers checked their screens, and soon it was clear that the story had already gone viral. The video of Carl's humiliating defeat was spreading like wildfire, and Michael knew that the consequences for Carl Jensen were just beginning. Carl's face went white as he realized the full extent of what had just happened. "Shut that down!" he barked at Brittany, but the young woman hesitated, her eyes darting nervously between him and the computer screen. It was too late. The video had already been uploaded, and there was no turning back now. As Michael exited the bank, his cap pulled low over his eyes, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. He had done what he had set out to do, not just for Linda, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unimportant. And as he walked out into the world beyond the bank's doors, he knew that the ripple effects of this moment would be felt for a long time to come. As Michael Jordan left the bank, his actions had set off a chain of events that would reach far beyond that moment. The video of the confrontation went viral, sparking outrage from the public and shining a light on the bank's systemic mistreatment of vulnerable customers. What started as a simple act of standing up for Linda had turned into a widespread call for accountability. Carl Jensen, once confident in his position, found himself facing the consequences of his actions. The video quickly spread across social media, with people from all walks of life sharing their own stories of mistreatment. Carl's refusal to take responsibility for his behavior was no longer an option. The truth had been exposed, and the public demanded answers. The ripple effect was felt not only by Carl but also by the bank's employees. Brittany, the young teller, stood at the counter, quietly reflecting on what she had witnessed. For the first time, she questioned the way the bank treated its customers, especially those who were elderly or vulnerable. Michael had shown her that empathy and accountability mattered far more than corporate policy. For Linda, the experience was transformative. The reversal of the charges was significant, but the real victory was in regaining her dignity. She felt seen, heard, and respected for the first time that day. And as the story spread, she realized her struggle had become part of a larger movement for fairness. Carl was placed on administrative leave, and the bank's management was forced to address the issues that had been brought to light. But the real impact of the incident was the lesson it taught. Standing up for what's right could change the course of events. Linda's story reminded everyone that no one should ever be made to feel invisible or powerless. And Michael's intervention inspired people across the country to take responsibility and demand justice when they saw wrongdoing. The incident had sparked a movement for change, one that would continue to grow, reminding people everywhere that they deserve to be treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. If you believe in standing up for what's right, in fighting for fairness and justice, don't let this story fade away. Share it with your friends, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful stories that can make a difference. We all have the power to challenge injustice and make our voices heard. Let's make a change together.